Nineteenth-century China, Part 2, 1842 to 1875. A variety of different social movements could manifest themselves in China during times of uncertainty. Bandits have been an endemic problem throughout Chinese history. Outlaw gangs would frequently inhabit places on the margins of society, outside of cities or in the wilderness areas where imperial control was weakest. Banditry tended to wax and wane along with economic conditions and the strength of the imperial government. The unsettled social conditions of the 19th century gave rise to this phenomenon. Secret societies were another category of groups on the margins of societies. These were groups of individuals that bound themselves together for a particular cause. In some cases, these societies were bound together by their hatred of the Manchus and desire to have native Chinese rule again. In other cases, they were involved in illegal activities like the triads, mafia-like organizations that were involved in the opium trade. The Opium War exacerbated both of these tendencies. It made the Manchus appear weak and therefore sparked greater opposition to them. The Opium Wars also shifted the opium trade further to the north, which adversely affected triad business. Some illicit groups were religiously oriented. We have already seen the White Lotus Society and the 8 Trigrams. Both of the groups were millenarian Buddhist sects that believed that the world would end soon. The Taiping Rebellion would incorporate elements of all of these illicit societies. China was racked by rebellion for most of the mid-19th century. The largest of these insurrections was the Taiping Rebellion, which would last from 1850 to 1864. The rebellion began with a teacher by the name of Hang Shu-quan. Hang wanted to be a high Confucian official but had failed the provincial examinations on 3 different occasions. On one occasion, while taking the exam in Guangzhou, he acquired a Christian missionary tract. He read the pamphlet and began to have dreams and visions. He became convinced that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He began to preach in the impoverished highlands of Guangdong and Guangxi. He attracted the marginalized to himself and even found common cause with some triad groups. He embraced an anti-Manchu message, becoming convinced they were demons in the flesh. Hang even denounced Confucianism, which he associated with governmental oppression. Finally, in 1850, he raised the standard of rebellion against the Qing and led his followers down out of the hills. Hang and his followers had incredible initial success. His followers were highly committed to Hang and his vision. The Qing armies had also severely declined from their apogee in the mid-18th century. So Hang and his followers achieved one success after another. They marched north to Wuchang and then east to the former Ming capital of Nanjing, which the Taiping declared as their capital in 1853. The Taiping thus had control over some of the richest and most productive regions of China. The Taiping imposed a radical social program on the areas under their control. They stripped treasure from the wealthy and collectivized farming. Hang required citizens to attend open-air sermons and to tear down religious images from other religions. The Taiping also attempted to reform society. They prohibited opium, prostitution, dancing, drinking, and foot binding. Despite their initial success, the Taiping also suffered from some serious setbacks. They were unable to press their momentum north to Beijing, the Qing capital, or east toward the wealthy port city of Shanghai. The Taiping leaders were also driven apart by internal strife. Furthermore, while the Qing proved to be ineffectual against the Taiping, a formal military opposition began to form. Local gentrymen, wealthy planters from central China, began to form themselves into militias. While these individuals may have shared in the Taiping animosity for the Qing, they were scandalized by the radical social program and their repudiation of core elements of Chinese culture. In a long war of attrition, the militiamen were able to grind down the Taiping and capture their capital in 1864. The destruction caused by the Taiping is difficult to comprehend. 14 years of mutual slaughter in China's most populous region resulted in an estimated 20 to 30 million deaths. To give some perspective, about 60 million people died in World War II. The economy was ruined. Great heaps of dead bodies lay unburied, and disease festered. Psychologically, this was another major blow to the Qing. Its armies had been completely ineffective against the rebels. It had been the militias, made up of Han Chinese, that had saved China. These militias stayed intact even after the war. It is important to keep in mind that while the Taiping was the largest mid-century rebellion, there were other rebellions happening at the same time. The Nineteenth Rebellion broke out in the Yellow River Valley in response to floods. The preoccupied Qing were unable to suppress it until 1868. The Pathay Rebellion in Yunnan in the south was sparked by tensions between Muslims and other ethnic groups and the Qing court. Finally, in the northwest, in Xinjiang, Muslim tribes revolted against Qing authority. Amid the Taiping Rebellion, the beleaguered Qing found themselves at war against Great Britain and France in 1856. The cause of the war was varied. One issue was a disappointment on the part of British merchants that trade with China was still meager even after the First Opium War. There was also the feeling that the Qing were not living up to their end of the Treaty of Nanjing. There was the belief that a resident ambassador in Beijing would go a long way in redressing their grievances. They were able to put pressure on Parliament through their powerful lobby. The actual incident that sparked the war involved the Chinese boarding of a ship flying the British flag in 1856, and Britain's subsequent declaration of war. The British, now joined by the French, struck and seized Canton in December of 1857. In May of 1858, they destroyed the Dagu forts, which guarded the way to Beijing, leaving the city vulnerable. After a pause for some unfruitful negotiation, hostilities resumed in 1860. This time, the British and the French marched on Beijing. The emperor was forced to flee, and to make a point, they burned the emperor's summer palace outside of Beijing. The war was concluded with the Treaty of Tianjin, which greatly expanded Western access to China. For the first time, Western powers were allowed to send ambassadors to Beijing. Christian missionaries were given the right to preach throughout China and were granted imperial protection. Westerners, including merchants, were allowed to travel in China. 11 new treaty ports were opened, and China agreed to pay 8 million taels of silver to the victorious powers as a war indemnity. The period after the Second Opium War was a period of unmistakable change for China. Western faces began appearing in major Chinese cities, even in its interior. Treaty ports stretched up the coast and along the Chinese heartland, the Yangtze River. Beijing had foreign ambassadors, and cities like Shanghai had a sizable foreign presence. Commerce with the West became much more regular, either through Westerners themselves or through compradors, Chinese acting as commercial agents on behalf of Westerners. The pace of change was surely shocking to many Chinese. Emperor Tongzhi came to the throne at the end of the Second Opium War. He was only 5 years old at the time, and so his mother Cixi acted as regent. We'll meet her again later. The reforms associated with his name came out of this period of crisis for China. 2 humiliating losses to foreign powers, decades of internal rebellion, and a collapsing imperial government all led to the need for change. The self-strengthening movement then emerged in response to the Western threat in particular, and the need for China to restore itself to meet the challenge head-on. The movement is associated with Feng Gaifan, a Confucian scholar committed to reform. His motto, Taiyong. To Feng, this meant using Western means and technology while keeping Chinese values. The Chinese knew little about the West in 1860. Reformers with the Qing government recognized the need to learn more about the West if it was to ever compete with it. They began by founding several schools for the interpretation of Western books in the 1860s. The Tongwen Guan School, or School for Combined Learning, opened in 1867. The school had foreign instructors and taught Western subjects like math, chemistry, geology, mechanics, and international law. China also began sending students abroad to learn about Western science and culture. This trend would continue, and by century's end, many students would be traveling abroad. While China had been a commercialized economy for a long time, its economy was pre-industrialized. Most of its manufacturing was organized along handicraft lines. The first factories opened in China were in treaty ports. They were Chinese-owned, but with foreign engineers, managers, and machinery. They were closely associated with the self-strengthening movement. Enthusiastic reformers saw in factories a way for China to modernize its military and improve its national defense. For the most part, they focused on heavy industries like coal, iron, and heavy machinery, those industries needed for defense. By 1875, when Tongzhi, the young emperor who gave his name to the era, died, China seemed to be making strides toward modernizing itself.